Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
Driverless cars, tougher car emission standards, and increasing biofuels production are some of the changes that may impact agriculture, the environment, and the economy. This week, two key lawmakers weigh in on the direction Minnesota should go. Stay tuned for this week's Capitol Report. Welcome to this week's program. I'm Shannon Loehrke. Last month, Governor Walz announced a move to new clean car standards. Joining me to offer his perspective on this and the legislature's role in setting transportation policy is the ranking DFL member of the Transportation Committee, Senator Scott Dibble. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Shannon.
Governor Walz's announcement that Minnesota will adopt clean car standards means that manufacturers will be required to offer a specific percentage of low-emission and zero-emission vehicles for sale in the state. Is this a good move?
I think it's a great move. Something to remember is that the whole country was on track to roll out these standards in total. So this isn't just the California clean car standards. This was going to be in alignment with the EPA standards. What the Clean Air Act allows for, of course, is to set certain fuel efficiency standards, and then, and really this is about helping reduce pollution and carbon dioxide emissions and the like. And then California, when the Clean Air Act was first adopted in the 1970s, was allowed to create more stringent,
yes,
cleaner standards. And then other states could adopt those standards for themselves.
And Minnesota would be joining 14 other states.
Right, I think, 13 or 14 other states. Under the Obama administration, the EPA and the California standards were brought into alignment. Now, just a few weeks ago or a few months ago, we learned that the Trump administration was going to separate those again, go back to the dirtier, less fuel efficient, more carbon dioxide emitting national standards, and is actually making a fairly aggressive move to prevent California from exercising its rights under the Clean Air Act. That remains to be resolved.
Right.
But in the meantime, what Governor Walz has ordered the Pollution Control Agency to do is to come into alignment with the California clean car standards, which we were already on track to do, and undergo a rulemaking process that'll take about 2 years to work out.
So he's basically making the statement that Minnesota is on the side of California and other states that are moving, want to move towards a cleaner technology.
Right, and the reason for that is that we've made a great deal of progress in bringing down our carbon emissions and reducing our carbon footprint in the energy sector, but we've made almost no progress at all really in the transportation sector. And now we see more carbon dioxide, more greenhouse gases coming from the transportation sector than we do from generating our electricity. There are other places we need to do some work as well, ag and forestry products and that sort of thing too, but we have the opportunity very easily, inexpensively, to make some significant changes in how we go about our transportation needs in a less polluting way. Keeps the public healthier, of course. Other kinds of pollution is reduced as well. And of course, lets us meet our goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and slow down global warming.
So this is coming from the governor's office,
right,
but there's also the legislature's role. Technology is changing faster than most people can comprehend, and the combustion engine is something that most people understand both intellectually and from their own experience. These new emerging technologies are often subsidized, in this case now mandated. What is the role of the legislature in these new and emerging technologies?
Well, keep in mind, this isn't about switching over to wholesale, completely changing the fleet to electrification. That'll be a part of the...
pointing in that direction.
Right, but in the meantime, what this does is it really creates fuel efficiency standards for the traditional gasoline-based combustion engine for the most part. And then some smaller percentage of vehicles that are part of the fleet that
like 5% or something like that, I thought.
Would be either zero emission or ultra low emission vehicles, probably electric. I mean, hydrogen, other forms of technology are allowed. It's really oftentimes the government's role to create these goals and these standards, even when it might be a little difficult to attain. But what happens ultimately is it allows those new technologies to become more widely adopted, more commercialized, and then suddenly the market takes over, cost comes down, and the technology is commercialized, the public benefit that's realized is achieved, and the technology becomes much more widely available. It's also government's role to provide the regulatory framework and the infrastructure and those sorts of things to make sure that things are the community and our society is running smoothly.
Now, Governor Walz said that the move is about protecting the environment, as you've mentioned, but it's also about choice. With this change, Minnesota will have access to more low-emission and zero-emission vehicles. I think 40 are on the market, and Minnesotans can now purchase 27 of them. This would bring up that number. But according to the Minnesota Auto Dealers Association, more than 80% of Minnesota's auto sales are for bigger vehicles like trucks, SUVs, and minivans, showing that Minnesotans are tending to want these larger vehicles as opposed to smaller, electric vehicles or vehicles like that. Critics are saying that this move actually means fewer options for Minnesota. Does this concern you?
Well, no, I think, first of all, we're talking about a very small percentage of required vehicle sales be low or zero emission vehicles. So the auto dealers are making a gross overstatement, and I don't know why they would be opposed, because, of course, they know that less than half of the available models are available to Minnesotans. Even if they want those available to them, the manufacturers won't bring those in because they don't get credit in this credit scheme. And if they don't want to bring them into Minnesota, they're available to go to the credit bank in those states that are more successful in selling more of the zero or low emission vehicles. They can bank those credits that they get for overperforming the goals that are set forth, and fulfill their obligations that way. So if in fact they don't or can't sell those kinds of cars in Minnesota, they're fine. But
so you're not saying it's not as black
majority,
and white as maybe it's been laid out to be?
No, not at all. Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to make one more point before I forget it, and that is the Minnesota Department of Health just released the findings of a study that show that up to 4,000 Minnesota deaths are attributable to air pollution. And of course, we know a great deal of that air pollution comes from the tailpipes of the vehicles that are being driven around our communities. And this will have a benefit in that regard too. Public health is a huge beneficiary of this change.
Minnesota is a vast state with climate extremes, as we all know. While these new technologies and greener standards will make sense to many in urban areas, how do you make the argument to those in greater Minnesota, rural areas, greater traveling distances, using heavy trucks for snow removal and hauling and putting their boats on the lake and ice houses? What's the balance?
Well, first of all, the technology is improving every day. So to the extent that that technology is not available to do that either longer distance or heavier load type work, it will come someday. But no one is being forced by anything they don't want today. This is about choice and about options and alternatives. And to the extent that the low emissions of higher fuel efficient vehicles are being sold, everyone benefits from that. That will be widely adopted commercialized technology. The cost curve has come way, way down and improving our gas mileage. And so folks in greater Minnesota should be pleased because they're driving greater distances at the opportunity to buy more fuel efficient cars. Also bear in mind that the schism now, the separation between what would be the national standards and the California standards has triggered resistance and a backlash from the manufacturers, or many of them, not all of them, but many of them are saying, no, we were on a good path here and we want to maintain that path in developing these technologies and bringing them to the public.
Senator Dibble, thank you.
Thank you very much.
For over 2 decades, the Minnesota Historical Society has offered the Shadows and Spirits of the State Capitol tour. What will guests encounter on this tour?
What we do is we recreate the historic lighting in the building as if you're walking into it for the first time in the early 1900s. And as you walk through these shadowy environs, you run into historical spirits, or characters that would have been part of the stories of Minnesota's Capitol.
On this tour, which spirits will guests encounter?
There's a variety of different people from the building's past. For instance, Judson Bishop is a Civil War veteran who will tell his stories about his war experiences, and that's based upon those beautiful paintings of Civil War regiments in the governor's reception room. We'll see Clara Euland, who is a woman suffragist, She's talking about the right for women to vote and that march to getting that right eventually. And also in the Supreme Court, where we're standing right now, we have the artist appears, and that's John Loehrke. She's the one who did these 4 murals that tell you the evolution, the changes of law throughout time.
Does the tour cover the entire Capitol?
It covers a lot of the different spaces that you would see on any regular tour. So we visit the Rotunda, that's where the tour begins, go to the governor's reception room, go to the Senate, the House Gallery, you get to see the chamber kind of from the bird's eye view, and then we come to the Supreme Court.
What kind of feedback have you gotten over the years from people who've experienced this tour?
Yeah, it's always very positive because you can come during the day to see our regular tours, and so you get one perspective of the building. But when you recreate the historic lighting, it really gives you a sense of what it would have looked like here 100 years ago. And I think people are just thrilled to see these different stories being told, and it's really just a really fun way to look at the Capitol in a different light.
Joining me to offer his perspective on some recent decisions by Governor Walz, as well as the feasibility of autonomous vehicle technology taking hold in Minnesota, is the Vice Chair of the Transportation Committee, Senator John Jasinski. Welcome.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks for having me.
Last month, Governor Walz announced that Minnesota will join 14 other states in adopting stricter auto emission standards by requiring that automakers offer more low-emission and zero-emission vehicles beginning in the year 2023. What's your view?
Well, you know, I'm not so much in favor of that. I think the auto dealers should have their choice and let the market determine what vehicles are offered and what people want. You know, California obviously has a lot more people than we do. They have a totally different climate that we do. So there's a lot of issues, and you know, I think the most important thing is we'd like to have hearings in the Transportation Committee. We'd like to have hearings on this and talk about it and have some debate with the stakeholders versus just having the governor come down with a standard. So I would wish that we'd have more hearings and talk about it, talk to the auto dealers, talk to the people, talk to the farmers, talk to people in different areas, in the suburban areas and the rural areas.
Is there anything that you could do legislatively because the governor is doing this through a rule change, is there anything legislatively that you could do in committee that would allow you to have your views heard? Well,
that's something we want to bring up. I'd like to see some informational hearings on it just to bring up the issue so people can input on this and how it may affect different stakeholders.
Okay. Also last month, the governor established a council on biofuels to help guide policy toward greater production and use of biofuels. The state has fallen behind the goals set by the bipartisan Next Generation Energy Act, which was signed by Governor Tim Pawlenty in 2007. Is the expansion of biofuels a good idea?
I believe it is, yes. I mean, our farmers are out there and they can help produce with biofuels, and it's a very strong economy, especially in rural Minnesota and in southern Minnesota. It's very strong. I think by increasing the amount we put in and that we're using, I think is a great thing for Minnesota.
Okay. In 2018, Governor Mark Dayton established an advisory council on connected and autonomous vehicles, which is called a CAV. Now Governor Walz is forming an advisory council to build on that work. So what are your thoughts on whether and how Minnesota should implement autonomous car technology or driverless cars?
Well, cautiously, I think. I mean, I actually authored the bill for the platooning bill for some trucks. They can actually go 3 in a row, and drivers have to be in those vehicles, but it's starting with the technology to make sure things are working and to make sure it's doing safely. So I think we have to be cautious about it, but I think definitely we're going in that direction. I think the car manufacturers and people want that now. They're seeing more and more of it. I myself have a Ram, and it has the lane assist and the adaptive cruise control. So you get used to those things, and they're very nice to have. But it's really kind of focused on the urban areas, rural areas with gravel roads and things that they can't follow. I mean, obviously you need the lines painted, so there's some issues you have to look at. And just the pure cost of having to upgrade the infrastructure is a little bit scary to me, because we've been trying to get more money for roads and bridges, and our townships need more money for roads. So the added cost of some of these things to add on those are concerning to me, so I think we have to look at it cautiously. And I would hate to see someone injured by a vehicle that was, not anybody in there that hit them. So I think there's a couple of cases of that out there now, and we want to be cautious of that just to make sure that we're protecting our citizens on the safety side of it.
To talk a little bit more about the platooning thing, so this is a way, we have long-haul truckers moving things around. Your bill would have a driver, a person in each truck, or just like in the first of a line?
In each truck would have a driver, just because, again, the safety issues, but they would be connected, and then they could stay closer together, so they wouldn't need the maximum distance between the two, and then they could benefit from drafting and things like that. The drivers would be in all of them if they needed to be, but they can actually use some of this technology to let them follow, and if they need to be to override, they can, but they'll have to be in the truck. And that was Senator Newman's and my concern as well, to make sure to have people in these until we really have the science perfected before we can actually take somebody out at some point in time.
In a sense, it's like airline pilots. The plane actually does a lot of its own flying, but there's still a human there in case of emergency.
Absolutely.
Okay. We're seeing incremental change, and you mentioned this with vehicles with park assist or emergency brake, or, there are functions that are coming on board that are making humans have to do less in their cars. But proponents of driverless vehicles contend that the time saving and the economic benefits that could be reaped from this occur when no one is responsible for driving the car at all. Is it the role of the legislature to decide, assistive technology versus completely autonomous, or is it the market, or is it both?
I think it's a mix of both. I think we need to make sure that we as the legislature and the state are comfortable with the safety and that it's not going to put someone in danger. And, I've been around for a long time. I was born in the 60s, and driving a car is something sometimes you like to do. I mean, I actually like to drive.
I do too.
And actually, for people to sit back and to be able to relax while somebody else is doing that is going to be different. So I don't know how to. I mean, it's definitely coming. But I think we have to take it slowly, cautiously, and make sure that we do have those safety mechanisms in place to make sure that people are safe. But it's eventually going there. The adaptive cruise control I have is very nice. It's changed the way I drive now, because when you're behind someone, you don't have to keep braking. It automatically brakes for you, and it does that. So it's changing, but I think we have to be cautious and watch how it progresses. But again, I think it's really more focused on the larger highways, suburban. You get out in rural Minnesota, is this going to work when you pull into a fair and want to get it parking in a field to get a spot? So I mean, there's obviously places where it's going to advance more faster, and then some areas they really need to look into more detail. And in addition to that, our weather, our climate with snow and those things are all things we got to look at. So it's very complicated, but I think Minnesota and a lot of states are moving forward.
Now, you mentioned that there was one incident, there may be more, but there's certainly one incident in 2018. An Arizona woman was hit by a self-driving Volvo that was being tested. And in that year, then 4 of your Senate colleagues introduced a bill that would ban self-driving cars from state highways and roads unless the automated systems are disabled and a person is actually doing the driving. Just from the point of view of the legislature and people's suspicion and fear and all of the roadblocks that you're laying out, is this an uphill battle in the legislature?
I think it is. I mean, it sounds great, but there's just a lot of things you have to work through. Stop signs, curve signs, no passing, all these things that you have to look into. And the patience of the people, if they want to be able to pass and they can't in the vehicle. And it's evolving, and I think it will continue to evolve, but I think it's going to, I think they call it the Class 5. There's 5 classes. To get to the Class 5, I think it's still quite a ways out there. As you said, I think it's Class 2 or 3, where they're assisting, but they're not actually doing it, is going well, that's progressing. But to get to the actual full stage of a Class 5 autonomous vehicle is going to be a ways, and I think. I don't know. Maybe they'll surprise us, but I just think there's a lot of issues we need to work through before we get to that.
Some of the reading I've done has said, in the 2020s, in the next 10 years, this technology is really going to come on board. But this technology also is going to rely heavily on infrastructure and the communication abilities between the vehicle and satellites or whatever. Just, there's a lot to think about. So considering that Minnesota is already challenged to maintain its current road, bridge, and transit infrastructure, how can the state really even consider, and what's the balance between transit? I mean, does driverless cars jeopardize, transit dollars, and do people own driverless cars? I mean, there's a lot of questions.
Well, it's all very competitive. There's no doubt about that. And just an example, so I have the driverless, as I said. Well, now I got the upgrade on the new Apple phone, and for some reason it's interfering with my wireless cell phone in my phone to connect, and it keeps rebooting. So there's a lot of little things just like that we have to look at in the future that could affect that and how it's done. And again, roads, bridges are very important. township roads and county roads throughout the state of Minnesota and rural Minnesota are really struggling for money. So to put all this great technology in the metro area and let rural Minnesota be overlooked is going to be very concerning to me. So I want to make sure that we have a good balance, but I think it's definitely something we're going to look at. But we definitely have to find a balance, that it's a good balance between rural Minnesota and suburban Minnesota, and getting between the two. So obviously the people in the metro get out to the rural areas and we come into the suburban areas. So that inner areas are areas that can be improved on this, but again, the pricing and how much we spend on it is going to be a concern to make sure that nobody in the whole state, or one Minnesota as Governor Walz calls it, doesn't get overlooked in this issue.
A cautious approach to emerging technology. Senator Jasinski,
Absolutely.
thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
Investigative work of the legislative auditor is critical in helping lawmakers ensure that state funds are being well spent. At a recent oversight hearing, Auditor Jim Nobles explained how his office handles sensitive accusations of fraud and mismanagement.
As it's come to light in the Department of Human Services, and employees have been reluctant to come forward, and we do the term whistleblower. Do you feel agency personnel, because I think they're some of the closest to the challenges we have, feel comfortable coming to you?
As a general rule, we do not want to be brought into a personnel matter. And another one of the complications is, and this is very difficult to deal with, there may be a legitimate management concern about that employee's performance. And so you have mixed together in there some legitimate concerns, possibly, about the performance of the agency. You have some legitimate concerns about the performance of the individual employee, and you sometimes simply have differences of personality, differences of opinion, differences that people have over the direction of a program. And I don't think it's really something we want to necessarily get involved in. But sometimes, frankly, the issue is so serious for the individual and for the department that we may take some action.
The Korean War is viewed as a frozen conflict because a peace treaty was never signed and the conflict lives on. A memorial to Korean War veterans on the state capitol grounds honors those who fought and who died. 748 Minnesotans died in the Korean War, which began in June of 1950 and ended in July of 1953. Paul Mandel of the Capital Area Architectural Planning Board joins me here at the Korean Memorial. What was the impetus for this memorial?
Well, after the Vietnam War memorial went in, the Korean War, of course, it was called a conflict, not even a war. They considered themselves the forgotten war. And even though they had a plaque, just like the Vietnam folks had, they said, well, we were forgotten, so can we get a memorial? And at the time, the Korean Memorial in Washington, D.C. had gone in just opposite the Vietnam Memorial. So this site became important sort of as a mirror to the Vietnam Memorial. Of course, they were older. We had two gentlemen that we work with through the main part of the group, and they're known with their blue jackets when they dress up. So we had the entryway. You have the various aspects, and even in the stone, which has now been replicated in the plaque inside the memorial space, you had the important dates of the conflict, as well as all the countries represented that took part in the war.
Yes, because the United States was just one of many that was involved in this conflict, which is ongoing because there was no peace treaty signed.
We have explained to them that, I mean, even as recent as these past few years, when Korea flares up, we've explained to them that if we go back and there's deaths, those names would be added. And even because of that, the fact that the war technically was never ended, they had an armistice, the names here, unlike in Vietnam where they're by date, here they're just scattered among. So all the names are included, but they're not in any particular order. So if you have a name added later on, there's no distinction between that name and the previous names.
Probably the most striking feature of this memorial is the sculpture of the soldier looking at his silhouette. What's being conveyed?
Probably the most important element is his search for his comrades, search for answers. I mean, those of us who grew up with MASH, you know, you see the questions, what is the end point, what is the goal, how do we know if we've succeeded, the fact that it never ended, the fact that it was just an armistice and not even a treaty. He walks towards his silhouette in the obelisk, which is larger than life, and actually it's on line with the Capitol Dome. So he's coming back to Minnesota. It was interesting because the vets studied the mock-up of this, and they were like, no, the belt would not be like that. No, these hand grenades were, you know, in 1952, they were not the hand grenades of the Vietnam War and the fatigues, and right down to the belt buckles and everything else. They studied every detail of this guy, and the sculptor kept, you know, while it was still in clay, kept molding it.
What are some of the unique features of this particular memorial?
Here, just like in the Vietnam Memorial, we have a map of Korea showing the Sea of Japan, the two Koreas, China. A lot of international folks have come here, and we have all the countries represented both in the flooring and now in the plaque that represent all the nations. So all the nations are included, even though this is a Minnesota Memorial. On the sides of the obelisks, we have, at first it was going to be the seals of the different branches of the armed forces, which we figured wouldn't mean anything to anyone except the members of the armed forces. So we have like a tank and a soldier on their feet for the infantry. We have a plane for the Air Force. We have ships for the Navy. So we made it literal representations of the different branches of the armed forces. And then the names, in part, like we have them alphabetical, but like I said, scattered among the letters, so there's no order, there's no first name or last name type, who's first and who's last type thing. And if we added names, it would be very democratic, and you wouldn't know that that was an added name.
The Korean Conflict Memorial was completed in 1998. It's been more than 20 years now since it was placed here. What are you hearing from people that have visited over the years?
Probably it's one of the more reflective and meditative ones. I mean, the Vietnam was, because some of the people had trouble getting up to the wall, this one is so approachable, and it really, they can get into this intimate space. They can sit, they can go off in the lawn area, they can go up and touch the names, but they can also just study the soldier and sit there and study the soldier or his silhouette. When people come to visit the governor's office from foreign countries, this is one of the ones they stop at for some reason, and they come down and they'll often contact the Korean veterans. Because a lot of their dignitaries, a lot of their people will purposely, they'll have a visiting group from Japan or whatever else, and they'll always come to this memorial because of the country's connection to that conflict.
Join us again next week as we delve into more topics affecting Minnesotans. I'm Shannon Loehrke, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.